Hello everybody and welcome back to the Eureka Centre here in UCC, and we're now going to have a look at answering this question, the writing of learning outcomes. Now this presentation is going to be slightly longer than some of the other presentations because I want to try to maintain the unity of the subject in doing it all in one presentation. So you may wish to have a strong cup of coffee before you settle down to this presentation. But the future is bright with learning outcomes. There's a great phrase in the Irish language, Islash iad na Kinnikigain, and the faraway hills are much greener without a doubt in learning outcomes, because it's much easier to write learning outcomes than it is to write aims and objectives. Now, the man who provided us with the toolkit for writing learning outcomes is Benjamin Bloom. Bloom did his undergraduate degree in education and master's degree in education in Penn State University, and then he went on to the University of Chicago where he did his PhD. And in undertaking his PhD, he looked at levels of thinking behaviour, and he was looking at sort of knowledge which was the recall of facts right up to higher levels like evaluation. He wrote this book on Bloom's taxonomy of education objectives in 1956, and without a doubt it was one of the finest books and most influential books in education ever written. And he based the book on his PhD, and in the book, and as you can see, way back in 1956, here we are still talking about Bloom's taxonomy. I learned about Bloom's taxonomy when I was training to be a teacher, and now that I'm involved in teacher training, we're still using Bloom's taxonomy. So it has stood the test of time. And in his book, he looked at these 6 successive levels, from knowledge, comprehension, application, and then the higher order thinking skills of analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And he called this area the cognitive, from the Latin word cognosco, meaning to learn, the cognitive domain, all about knowledge and thinking. And he said that in this domain, we can characterize it by means of action or active verbs. Now, before I progress, let me just digress for 20 seconds to emphasize that an action verb is all about doing. And we're going to be using action verbs a lot in writing learning outcomes. So it's a doing verb. The opposite to an action verb is a stative verb, like know, understand, appreciate, believe. So action verbs are used in writing learning outcomes. Stative verbs are used in writing aims and objectives. So what Bloom said was that if we want to test a student's knowledge of something, we ask them to do certain things. So we could ask them to, for example, to define or describe or to state a fact or recall a fact. And examples of action verbs would be things like recall, identify, describe, list, define, outline, describe. Now, I want you to note 3 things about the learning outcomes on the screen there. Number 1, they all begin with the action verb. Number 2, they're all simple sentences, not very long. And number 3, they go across all types of knowledge. Here you have science, here you have ethics, here you have the law, here you have medicine, okay? Here you have the law again, here you have history, there you have engineering, and there you have mathematics. So learning outcomes are simple to write as long as you start with an action verb. Moving up to Bloom's taxonomy, we come to comprehension. And he described comprehension as the ability to understand new and interpret new information. And again, Bloom listed out in his book some action verbs. Now, if you go back to Bloom's original book, you won't find this very comprehensive list, because what I did for this presentation and for the book on learning outcomes that I referred to in the first presentation, I added to it as the literature developed since the 1950s when Bloom wrote the book. So again, examples of action verbs in this area of Bloom's taxonomy: differentiate, identify, discuss, predict, translate, convert, explain, classify, recognize, explain, recognize, and so on. Again, notice they're all simple sentences. Moving up to the third level of Bloom's taxonomy. So if you want to test if a student has the ability to apply the knowledge and understanding that they've gained. Now, notice this shows one of the hallmarks of what a taxonomy is all about. You cannot apply your knowledge of something unless you have an understanding of it. And you cannot have an understanding unless you have the knowledge to begin with. So everything is built up in a very logical fashion. And again, Bloom left us with the toolkit. So, for example, we could be asked to do a calculation, or he could ask us, for example, to illustrate a point, or to sketch a circuit diagram, to solve a problem. And again, lots of examples: construct, apply, show, relate, modify, show, and so on. Moving up, and apply there in medicine. Moving up to number 4 in the area of analysis, again, we're looking now for interrelationships, breaking down information into its components. And again, Bloom left us with the list of action verbs, as you can see there. Notice, in some cases, the same verb appears in more than one category. So, for example, in the area of calculate, calculate appears in both analysis and application. It depends on the context. So if in mathematics, for example, you were to say on an examination paper for a student, calculate the periodic time of a pendulum in an old grandfather clock using the formula T equals 2 pi times the square root of L over G. There the students would take the formula and put in the variables and work out the periodic time of the pendulum. You've given them the formula. On the other hand, if you set an exam question in which you didn't give the formula, and students would have to go back through all the various mathematical formula they've learned in order to pick out the right one. So their minds are operating at level 4 because they're analysing the problem and deciding what equation they will use to calculate the periodic time. And again, in analysis, the word analyse, compare and contrast, categorise, debate, you can see there: calculate, critically analyse, and recognise. Okay, up to number 5, the area of synthesis, where we're expecting our students to put together and pull together parts from the module that we've taught them and come up with new ideas. Again, Bloom left us with a list of action verbs, as you can see there on the screen. And again, it's very easy to write examples of these. I won't spend much time on them because you have access to these PowerPoints, so everything is written on them. And finally, then we come to the very top of Bloom's taxonomy in the cognitive domain, the idea of evaluation, the idea of the ability to make a judgment of the value of the material. And again, Bloom left us with a list of action verbs from which we can choose when writing a learning outcome, and examples of learning outcomes in the area of evaluation: assess, use the word evaluation itself, appraise, predict, summarize, and assess. Now, these action verbs are all summarised in a simple table. You may not even be able to read what's on the screen there in front of you, but it's something that you can refer back to. And as I'm giving this lecture, a sort of handy little postcard is being produced that will be sent out to staff. Now, just one point in passing, sometimes people Google Bloom's taxonomy and they don't get Bloom's taxonomy, they get Anderson and Krathwohl's taxonomy. Anderson and Krathwohl brought out an update, they called it, but it really wasn't great, in 2001. And basically they swapped synthesis and evaluation. It wasn't very popular, and in the literature, most authors refer back to the original of Bloom. Bloom died in 1999, and 2 years after his death, this came out. So when I talk about Bloom's taxonomy, I'll be talking about Bloom's taxonomy as it stands in the original book written by Bloom, rather than the Anderson and Krathwohl's taxonomy. Now, Bloom wrote also another book on the affective domain, in which he spoke about the attitudinal area, feelings and values. Now, the best way to explain this to you would be to look at some action verbs for the affective domain. So in the affective domain, words like appreciate would turn up a lot, or value, or praise, or anything in which the students have an empathy for the work that they're doing. Now, if I give you some examples, for example, would be accept the need for professional ethical values, appreciate the need, display a willingness, relate to participants, resolving issues, embracing responsibility, participate in class discussions. So everything to do with beliefs and values. Many of these, of course, can be very difficult to assess, and the assessment of learning outcomes will be covered in a future talk in this series. The third and final domain, which Bloom referred to because he never wrote a book on it, so he only referred to it, he recognized in its existence. He didn't feel confident in writing a book on it because he didn't have experience of teaching in what was called the psychomotor domain. This is where you're actually doing things, sort of hand and eye coordination. Psycho meaning the mind, motor meaning manipulation skills. And examples of these, for example, in the laboratory. If you're teaching a practical subject, then there'd be particular practical skills that you'd expect your students to gain in the module or in the program. Then there's clinical skills, obviously, and then there's things like presentation skills that we look for when assessing the teaching ability of our student teachers, for example. How do these things look in practice? Well, as you know, we have in university, College Cork, on successful completion of this module, students should be able to. This is the prompt to help us to make sure that each learning outcome starts with an active verb. And you can see here, this is written by my colleague, Dr. Eleanor O'Sullivan, fifth year dental students, so their final year. So a lot of these learning outcomes would be in the higher order thinking skills, so that these final year dental students could pull together, the biochemistry, the microbiology, the material science, and so on that they've learned, and synthesize them together so that they become very proficient dentists. So the challenge then that we have when we're beginning the task of writing learning outcomes or refreshing some of the learning outcomes we have written is that they must be clearly written. Always ask yourself the question, what must I ask students to do in order to show me that they've achieved the learning outcome? As we mentioned, that sentence is very helpful. More than one sentence is possible to use it, and in fact even more than one learning outcome. That's not a problem. But avoid complicated long sentence. If you have to use more than one sentence, I would recommend you put it in a separate learning outcome rather than try to squeeze a whole pile of different learning outcomes into the one. The literature generally recommends between 5 and 8 learning outcomes in the module, and avoiding certain words. Now, I realise this slide is full of information. I don't even expect you to read it off the screen. But when you're sitting in your office having the right learning outcomes, be aware of the advice that they're given. Basically, they're saying, you must use active verbs and avoid words like appreciate and understand. Appreciate is fine in the affective domain, but it's rarely you come across it because it's very difficult to assess. So never use the word appreciate in the cognitive domain. Other words that the literature tells us to avoid like words like understand, know, be aware of, because they're too vague. They're fine for aims and objectives, which are vague statements anyway, but they are crystallized. You might remember the diagram that we showed you in the first of these presentations, where we showed the scientists looking into the microscope. And that's what learning outcomes are doing. They're helping us to get a clearer picture. So basically, all of these authors are agreed on one thing, and that is avoid words like know, understand, be familiar with, be aware of, appreciate, because they're too vague. That's essentially what the literature is saying. So if you avoid those words, you're doing well. The most common error that I encounter in writing learning outcomes is using the word understand, or the word appreciate in the cognitive domain. The question is, if you understand, what must the student do for you to show that they have this understanding? Grand. So there's a little checklist there that might be helpful to you when you come to write learning outcomes for the module or for the program. So to summarize it, the rules for writing learning outcomes are very clearly defined in the literature. Bloom's taxonomy is the toolkit. Always start a learning outcome with an active verb and use short, simple sentences. If you find the need to write a second sentence, then start a new learning outcome. And you can have more than one action verb in a learning outcome. Avoid the status verbs, and we've seen that from Bloom's taxonomy, he provides us with the toolkit to write learning outcomes both in the cognitive, the affective, and the psychomotor domain. So thank you all very much for sticking with me until the very end. Thanks for your kind attention.